Hello, everyone. My name is Gina Bennett. I'm amazed there are this many people at 4 o'clock on a Friday.
Do they know it's 4 o'clock?
I don't even know why I'm here. Just kidding, Bruce. We are going to do things a little bit differently for 2 reasons. One, because Tricia has a class at 5:30.
Talk about hardcore.
So we really have to stop at 5 so she can get to her students, and because I'm actually going with her to talk to her students, so that's 2 out of 3. We're going to have to bolt.
I'll just leave you here. I'll just be here alone.
You could do it.
I could do it.
But so that's one reason, and the second reason is because we're just different, and we're cool with that. So we would like you to read bios in here, so I can just very quickly tell you she's fabulous, she's awesome, and I'm fierce. So if you remember nothing else, you got it. So we're going to go straight into our thoughts on terrorism leadership, starting with Liz. And again, I have to say this because I am still an employee, so when it gets to me, my remarks are not representative of any agency. They are my own remarks. And I will only answer questions that I can, so very sorry. And I will keep to my script that has been pre-approved, very sorry again. But I will answer the question from Nick earlier, if any of you remember his question. It was about 40. So for those of you who remember the question, that'll make sense. Yeah. And with that?
So on behalf of all of us, I truly am also amazed that everyone is here at 4 o'clock on a Friday afternoon. There are many other places you could be, and so we are grateful that you are here. I also wanted to say a special thank you to Bruce and to Jordan Money, who's out in the hall, without whom none of this would be possible, insofar as she organizes registration and food, the fact that you all have been well-fed and well-hydrated over the last several days. But I do want to just say right at the beginning, as someone who has worked at SSP for a while, I am very grateful for the rich relationship that we at Georgetown have with St. Andrews. And it has borne such significant research and such dynamic relationships and engagement. And I think I can speak for all of us when we say, as a result of being in this room for the last 2 days, I think that we are all better for it, for the nature of that dynamic relationship. So I just wanted to thank you for Bruce and to thank you for all of you for traveling to come here today. So I think it is only fitting that ours is the last panel. Though there is something a little overwhelming about being the last panel on the last day when we're the only thing separating some of you from barbecue or going to the tombs, right? But ours touches on so many of the concepts that have been brought up over the last 2 days. And in fact, I was furiously taking notes and even showed Tim beforehand just all the different points that people had mentioned that explicitly or implicitly touch on the topics that all 3 of us are going to talk about over the next hour. And so what Dr. Bacon and I would like to do is to present, essentially, we're going to use our time to present a model that we have developed about terrorist leadership. And so the organization for our marks, we're going to first just discuss our puzzle, just the question that gives rise to our research, our interest in terrorist leadership, bless you, the relevance to current events, what's happening right now in the world, and then the 2 factors that we are most interested in is institutionalization and management style, how those factors impact how leaders function. Then we're going to actually say what our model lays out. Tricia and I very excitedly asked for the help of Joey Stabile, our co-collaborator, to develop charts and graphs in anticipation of our conversation today, only to come in and realize it's going to be a little more low-tech than we thought. So I will literally be holding up an 8.5 by 11 sheet of paper, and Richard English can tell everyone in the back what it says. So we'll talk about what our model lays out, and then Tricia's basically going to wrap up with what cases are we looking at to illustrate the dynamics that we are most interested in. And so what is the puzzle that we care about? It is that leadership is the most discussed and least understood concept. I might say in the world, maybe that's a bold statement, but I will at least say in terrorism studies. Because on our read, the field of terrorism studies has maintained a very conspicuous silence about how leaders matter and also under what conditions the leaders matter. Now, there have certainly been scores of work examining, for example, the life, the studies, the dynamics of Osama bin Laden, right? So a man whose ability to maintain legitimacy, a man whose ability to maintain credibility over a movement for decades came down to the image he projected of himself, which is a man who is willing to do anything, a man who's willing to sacrifice everything for Islam. In addition, there have been other sort of first image, first-person stories. Books about Guzman, books about Öcalan, books about Shoko Asahara. But this study of terrorism leadership, it's highly individualistic. It focuses on their personality traits, their background, their education, who they interacted with. It focuses on these specific traits of terrorist leaders. And while those individual characteristics certainly do matter, what remains understudied is what other factors actually also impact how the leader functions, beyond just the study of the traits, beyond who they studied with at university. So in terrorism studies, you have these sort of first image, first person stories. And then on the other end of the spectrum, you also have studies, many of them large data examinations, that study the effects of the tactic of decapitation. And so studying the effects of decapitation, whether or not scholars study impacts on operations or impacts on lethality, all of those studies actually require assumptions, sometimes meta-assumptions, about how leaders matter. Assumptions that to date have not actually been systematically tested or systematically examined. And so what we have is this sort of gulf between these tightly focused first-person stories and then these large N research projects about leadership. But we have this enormous abyss in the middle. And that is where Tricia and I are situating our work. How do leaders matter? And how does that change over the course of the organization's lifespan? And so the so what for us. Tricia and I both come from practitioner backgrounds, and the first question that we ask our students, the first question that we ask of our research is, why does this matter? Why is this an important question? Is that we believe that this puzzle of how leaders matter is one of the single most critical puzzles in all of terrorism studies, and it's often been assumed rather than actually systematically problematized. In fact, despite the robust literature on decapitation, despite the robust reliance on decapitation as a CT tactic, we are no closer to understanding the contours of this dynamic, the conditions under which it is effective, what effective means. And to prove our point, you actually need to look no farther than the slew of articles that were published after Baghdadi's death. So you have some category of articles saying things like, his death would damage but not destroy ISIS. Then you have a category of articles saying his death will have no effect, won't matter at all. And then you have a third category of articles that say things like his death will actually cause the threat from ISIS to increase. But what was Baghdadi's actual role in the organization? How did he matter for ISIS? How did that change over time? And what were those factors that shaped his role as a leader? And one of the things that we noted against this backdrop of all these questions and articles that came out after Baghdadi died is that the exact same questions were asked after bin Laden's death some almost decade earlier. The exact same questions, despite the fact that the research program on decapitation in this subsequent decade has grown that much deeper, that much richer. In fact, for those of you that were here yesterday for the panel on Iran and Hezbollah, Professor Byman asked the exact same question to Aryan Tabatabai. What impact would Soleimani's death have? How did he matter? And her answer actually explicitly touched on aspects of institutionalization, aspects of his own personal traits, but didn't explicitly dive into that. And so we actually want to situate our work based on something that Richard English said a few minutes ago. The terrorism studies has these very sort of first-person narratives, these tightly rich narratives, people who know everything about Peru, and there are people who know these large end data sets manage these data sets around decapitation. We think that we need to have a dialogue between these two dynamics, that we want to bridge the gap between these two robust research programs, and we want to move past these explanations that have existed about terrorism leadership in the past. And so our argument is that we believe that the characteristics of the leader, insofar as he manages his group, and the institutionalization of the group, it gives rise to several different leadership roles. And so we constructed, ta-da! It's a dynamic model that I'm sure literally, even it might be hard to see 5 feet away. I can't even tell, right? Yes, everyone's like, yes, that's appalling. If I had a dry erase marker or a crayon, I could have done a larger drawing, but here we are, right? So for those of you with extraordinary eyesight, or at least just a dynamic imagination, we created a model that maps this x-axis and y-axis. And I'm just going to hold it up because it's so pretty, right? So on this y-axis, we have the factor of institutionalization, so group institutionalization. We also wanted to move away, as Dr. English had said before, from these sort of binary designations. Is a group institutionalized or not institutionalized? We actually developed a set of criteria that included 8 different characteristics of what institutionalization looks like. I'm happy to talk about that in Q&A or over tea later, not cigarettes, just tea later, right? Drawn from existing literature from institutions and bureaucracies. So at the topmost end, which I'm sure you all can see, of this high institutionalization, these are highly structured groups. They tend to operate with clear standard operating procedures, clear specialized departments, a very established chain of command. At the lowest end, these are groups that lack those systematic processes, and as a result, they operate in a highly decentralized manner. As you can also see on the x-axis, our x-axis, that relates to how the leader manages the group. And it ranges all the way on the left from a sort of symbolic leadership to all the way on the right to this very hands-on type of leadership. We developed this criteria from a deep reading of business management literature, organizational management, partially because there are other fields that have said a lot more about leadership than terrorism studies. And probably the most notable among them is organizational management, business literature. So on this far left, on this symbolic side, these are leaders that they have been imprisoned, they've been forced into hiding, but they've developed a cult of personality. And they continue to exert authority over the group in more ideological terms, in more normative terms, through stories and taboos and myths. So that's on that far left. On the far right, these are leaders who directly oversee operational planning. These are leaders who are personally involved in calibrating the level of violence over their group. They also could be heavily involved with negotiations with other states or non-state actors. And so what we then have as a result is a matrix, right? The intersection of these factors gives rise to 4 sets of roles that leaders play. But as some of you can see, there's a little slash through all of these blocks, because even as institutionalization interacts with management style, all of this is mitigated by the environment that the groups are operating in, and specifically the CT pressure that those groups are facing. And so our frame for this argument is drawn from a business theory called personal situational leadership. That says if you want to understand the impact that leaders have, you have to look at 3 sets of forces: the leader themselves, the group, and the environment that they're operating in. And so by mapping these factors, so again, the relationship behavior of the leader for hands-on or symbolic, the level of institutionalization of the group, and then also the readiness which the followers can even exercise those initiatives based on the environment that we're operating in, it generated essentially 4 quadrants of leader types. I will just walk you all through them since you are so far away. So quadrant 1, it's all the way, you'll have to imagine this on the far top right, right? So this is high institutionalization and a hands-on management style. Ta-da! On the bottom, this is low institutionalization, and it's still a hands-on management style. Right here in 3, we have low institutionalization, but a symbolic management style. And then in the very top, we have high institutionalization and that symbolic management style. So obviously, this generates types of leaders, roles that leaders play, functions that they play. In that top right quadrant, we assess that leaders often serve the role as an administrator. Administrators put forward processes that organize, that mobilize, that instruct members on how to pursue the strategic and ideological objectives of the group. And then in that role, administrators, because of the level of institutionalization, they're able to communicate that vision in oral and written forms through things like meeting agendas, notes, standard operating procedures. In that next block down, you have the role of the advisor. And this is where leaders want to play that role. Leaders strive to play that role of mitigating competing personalities, of mitigating maybe societal or ethnic identities. But they are limited by the decentralization, by the weak institutionalization of the group. In this lowermost block, this quadrant 3, we have leaders playing the role as figureheads. That the primary role that the leader is serving is that they're providing that sort of overarching vision, that raison d'etre to their followers. And so what this looks like is that that leader, that figurehead, can maintain authority even when they are not physically present. And often they are not physically present because of the level, because of the weak institutionalization. But what binds the leaders to their followers is the employment of stories, is the employment of myths, the employment of taboos that bind the leader through that connection, even when the leader is not physically there. So much of that theorizing is drawn from the work of Weber in his talking about the bind that leaders can develop, this charismatic bond that leaders can develop with their followers. And then ultimately at this top left block, these are the dictators. These leaders at the head of organizations, they possess mechanisms to indoctrinate, to punish, to monitor. And they also, as a result of their symbolic leadership, end up developing this production of personality cults, cult of personality, micromanaging policies. Many of the groups that exist in that block, they force their members through rigorous, often brutal screening. And they conform to this sort of cult of personality idea. So I'm going to turn it, bless you, I'm going to turn it over to Trish just to walk through how we've mapped groups to these various quadrants. I can hold it up if you like.
I think your arms will get sore.
They will.
So what we then did was took a look in some depth. After we really surveyed a lot of groups, we looked in depth at 4 specific organizations, which involves 8 leaders. And we looked at the kind of leadership authority style they had, their level of institutionalization, and their degree of CT pressure. And what's interesting is we looked at over a broad span of time, as early as the 1920s till basically yesterday. And then we're also looking at the evolution within the same organization. So we have sort of a broad span of time we're looking over the course of groups' lifespan, and then we're looking across cases. And one of the things that I want to make sure that we flag is it was something we really grappled with early in the project. We're not making arguments about the effectiveness of the leaders. That's, I think, a trap that we could sort of easily get into. I think if you were to analyze some of these leaders, some of them you would argue were better leaders than others in the context that we're talking about these kinds of organizations. So we're not assessing like this type is better than this type, or one of the individuals we're looking at was a more effective leader. We really stepped away from the idea of effectiveness to more try to identify different types of leaders. So we looked at Al-Shabaab, AQI, Egyptian Islamic Jihad, and the KKK. So we have this span of organizations. And interestingly, the first one that we looked at is Al-Shabaab. And this case has a fair amount of within case variation. It is on the more institutionalized end of the spectrum. Really, once the group emerges as an independent organization, it's fairly institutionalized from an early point. But of course, it has a huge organizational variation over time. It's everything from an insurgent organization to a quasi-state over the course of its lifespan. So it has a huge amount of organizational variation. But at each different point, it's fairly institutionalized in the type of organization that it is. And we have the founding leader who survives almost 10 years, a little less than 10 years in terms of his leadership of the organization. And he was very much a hands-on leader, Ahmed Godani. And this, of course, opened him up to a lot of counterterrorism vulnerabilities that eventually catch up with him. But what's interesting is his hands-on leadership style combined with the institutionalization of the organization means that he puts in place a structure for the organization that really sustains after he's killed. And you have a different type of leader take the helm, one who is virtually invisible. In fact, there's rumors probably every 6 months that he's not alive anymore. He's so symbolic within the organization that he's basically a ghost of sorts. And so he's taking on a much different role as the symbolic leader within an institutionalized organization. And Al-Shabaab has really experienced a range of counterterrorism pressure over its lifespan. And I don't mean just the size of the AMISOM contingent that's in Somalia, also the posture of AMISOM. AMISOM has gone through phases where it's pretty offensive, and then phases like now, where it's basically a status quo situation. So Al-Shabaab has really experienced a range of counterterrorism pressure as well, and has really, over the course of its lifespan, had 2 different types of leaders within the institutionalization side of the spectrum. The second group that we're looking at on the institutional side of the spectrum is Al-Qaeda in Iraq and its subsequent iterations. And again, this is an organization that has an incredible amount of range in terms of what kind of organization it is. But it too had a fair level of institutionalization as these different kinds of organizations. But AQI has really leaned more on the symbolic side of the leadership. And yet that isn't to say there isn't any hands-on leadership, but its leaders have been much more in the symbolic realm than, say, for example, Godani, who was very much a hands-on leader. So we put them in that side of the spectrum. So you have 3 leaders over time who are all fairly symbolic leaders in this highly institutionalized environment, which produces a dictator type of leader. And while AQI has experienced varying levels of counterterrorism pressure, I think probably we can all agree in terms of the overall counterterrorism environment, it's experienced high levels of counterterrorism pressure overall. The third case we looked at is on the low institutionalized side of the spectrum. And this is looking at Egyptian Islamic Jihad during the 1990s. And in contrast to AQI and Al-Shabaab, this is a group that never really institutionalizes, in part because of the counterterrorism pressure environment that it is working in. It's got extensive pressure from the Egyptian government and then is operating overseas in a dispersed manner and experiences growing counterterrorism pressure over the 1990s. And so it's operating really in these compartmentalized cells with one leader throughout most of its post-Sadat assassination period in Zawahiri. And Liz and I have written elsewhere that we don't think Zawahiri is really a bang-up leader, but in this context, that's not so much what our interest is. Our interest was how he managed the organization, and he was an incredibly hands-on leader. I would argue that if you worked for him, you'd call him a micromanager. He was the guy who was sending emails like, why did you spend that much on a fax machine? You know, he was a very, very hands-on leader, and that's both a joke and true. So he really is operating in that advisor role where you have low institutionalization, high counterterrorism pressure, and a very hands-on leadership approach. And then we have a case that is in a lot of ways similar and a lot of ways different, and that is looking at the KKK in the 1920s. It too is a religious organization in a lot of respects, but it's not a Sunni jihadist group like the other organizations. And interestingly, when we mapped sort of the spectrum of terrorist organizations, this is the quadrant that was fairly sparse when we were deciding which cases to look at. This is the low institutionalization, do you want to? Symbolic leader. And what we find is the 2 grand wizards of the KKK during this period were very, very symbolic leaders with basically no hands-on management involvement. And they are operating in a counterterrorism environment that is probably the least pressure that you can imagine. They're operating with impunity. There's very little legal consequences. There's even members of the government or local law enforcement that are part of the organization. So it's really got a free hand in terms of the counterterrorism environment. And yet you have this very dispersed network that is not institutionalized, that spans the United States. It's very much a cells and autonomous organizations. So they're operating as the figurehead type leader that we identified in our typology. And so what I think our next major step is in this project is to understand the impact of decapitation on different types of leaders. So if one of the questions that comes up again and again is how does a specific leader's death matter? Again, we often are looking at highly individual factors or large N. How does the number of operations change? How many people they kill change? And what we're arguing is we think that the next step in this research paradigm is to look at how killing different types of leaders matter, which is to say they probably matter to some degree in all cases, but matter differently. After Godani was killed, I remember there being some predictions that Shabaab was on the verge of collapse. And actually what happened is a new leader came in and nothing really changed. And so I think that's one of the things that we're trying to sort of take forward as the so what with this project.
Absolutely. And just to piggyback on that as a final word, we believe that our research is situated essentially at the mission of what SSP here does, which is that it has benefits both to scholarship but also to policymakers. And so on the scholarship side, sort of marrying literature that comes outside of pure political science, right? So drawing insights from business literature. We actually also relied on sports management literature, theological literature, to help us understand better how groups interact with leaders and also in the environment. We think that there's a tremendous benefit to be gained there. And just as Tricia said, on the policymaking side, what it suggests is that expectations about what decapitation can achieve have to be managed, have to be calibrated with respect not just to the institutionalization of the group, but also to how the leader managed the group in the first place. And so only a deeper understanding of those leadership dynamics, to the point that Nick made just a few hours ago, can help better allocate resources, better allocate planning to this tactic of decapitation.
Thank you.
To you. Yeah.
Okay, so unlike my colleagues here, I am not going to be approaching this question from a scholarly perspective. I don't have that background, and I haven't had that opportunity to do the sort of deep research that you both have done. But I hope my observations from my experience, my career, will complement what you're saying, because a lot of it, it's like, yeah. So I'll try to explain it with a little more clarity. But first, let me say, and for those who haven't read the bio, I have 32 years in the intelligence community, all of which has been in counterterrorism, with the exception of, a handful of maternity leaves, five kids. So my experience has been, or my observations are drawn from doing three things in counterterrorism. One is identifying and disrupting terrorist plots, so the actual attacks. The other is identifying and helping to find terrorist leaders. And then finally, trying to understand how we can evolve counterterrorism tactics and operations to match the changing landscape of terrorism. So I draw my observations entirely from all of that. And I think I'm having a 1993 moment, which I will explain in a minute, just putting a marker down. I think that another aspect of leadership to consider is what we call the life cycle of terrorism, is where the leader is in the life cycle of terrorism. And life cycle makes it seem like it's just, or for you guys, this way. It's not. It's a constant circle. But from our perspective, when we're thinking about what we might be able to disrupt, it matters where in the life cycle of an attack, for example, that you are hoping to intervene. So on the one hand, you have the beginning and the foundational part of the life cycle, where the social and political alienation, the lack of alternatives that are in any way constructive or peaceful or realistic, pushing communities of people towards desperation and increasingly vulnerable to the idea of extremist ideologies and extreme constructs for solving their problems and dealing with their grievances, all the way to terrorism. So this is the setting the stage. That never stops. That's constantly got to be fed. But that is a big, big problem. And I would argue pre-1998-ish time frame, that used to be the purview of foreign policy. That was not what the counterterrorism missions did. In fact, at CIA, it was called the Counterterrorist Center, deliberately, because we weren't countering terrorism. Intelligence community was not going to counter terrorism. It had to be sound foreign policy and, of course, domestic policies in countries with these vulnerable populations. So that's back when we understood the limits of our mission, or our mission capabilities, I would say. The second part, though, is you start to, from that pool of vulnerable communities, and when you start to see the extremist influencers and influence, you narrow down to looking at more organized networks or cells. Some terrorist groups are never highly organized. Some are very highly organized. Most of the time, they're both. There's a lot of either-or discussion that does not happen in reality. So that, I think, is something to dive into, because I think a lot of organizations that I have looked at are operate on both ends of your spectrums all the time. So in the middle here, you have individuals, though, who are beginning to realize that violence is an option. In fact, violence is being sanctioned by certain people, and so now we want to build the capability. That is the primary space for counterterrorism broadly to work. In that area, that's where we usually have legitimate intelligence or law enforcement information to be more invasive and disruptive in our activity, to counter that activity. Early in the late 1980s and early 1990s, there was a strategy within the intelligence community to criminalize all aspects of terrorism. So it was really in this bucket, not the ideologies, not the thinking. We didn't get into the politics, but back in the day, if you were involved in documents fraud for an extremist ideology that was going to become violent, it was a lot easier to talk to a foreign government and say, hey, you got a documents fraud ring going on here. And just divorce ourselves of the conversation of the why, who are these people going after? Because we had the problem of one man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter. So anyway, right there in that middle space is where the broader counterterrorism community has a lot of opportunity to make a difference. And we're not talking about decapitating leaders here. We're talking about using usually law enforcement or other types of even civil organizations that can influence what's happening here. Private sector, all sorts of partnerships. The final realm, though, is the plot is already planned. You already have a terrorist mastermind, or we call a plot manager, who's working the plot. They've already been training people. They have the funding. They have the concept, and they're in this stage of prepping for that attack. That can happen over the course of 10 years. It can happen over the course of 2 days, as we have more recently seen. That has accelerated over time, while with some groups, it's still a very long process. So there's, again, no either or. We're dealing with both. But when you get over there, your options for taking your time diminish. And really the counterterrorism intervention at this point is hardening the facility, changing security profile, trying to deter or delay the attack. And often that's all you can do, and it'll still show up later or reinvented. But at any rate, that's a different part. That is arguably where most of the CT intel work was pre-9/11, and I would argue that's where it's going to have to go back as we go into this resource-constrained environment and the world realizes that terrorism is not the existential threat that we thought it was, and we go back to more of a global power competition framework. So I'm actually looking forward to that. I feel like maybe we'll put the genie back in the bottle a little bit and reduce this sense of fear and doom over terrorism, because I never would have imagined we were where we are today. So the reason the life cycle is important is because we're really good at rationalizing what we will do and won't do with leaders across that life cycle. And I don't understand that. So we talked, a few people have talked about torture. I only understand enhanced interrogation techniques. But on the end of when the attack is about to happen, we're willing to do a lot of things in that moment, and we almost don't care who the person is, or what they are, where they've come from. We're thinking, stop the fire, right? Prevent the death, the destruction. In the middle, we tend to be rather collaborative across the world, and even sometimes across the U.S. government departments and agencies, although that's probably rarer, which we'll get to in your class later, yeah. But the middle part tends to be not slow, but it's collaborative and deliberate. The front end, some folks have mentioned CVE. We're not doing that. We just don't. If we do anything there, we contribute to the problems rather than, and I think that's why today there are more members of Al-Qaeda than there were on 9/11. But at any rate, in the front end, this is where I find it very unusual how we decide with some terrorist influencers, to use today's parlance, I think is brilliant because it really is the truth, how with some influencers, we decide those are terrorist leaders and we need to remove them from the battle space. And with others, we're just like, it's just talk. Now, I'm a very logical person, and stuff like that really hurts my brain because again, I've been trained to warn. That's all my brain knows how to do is put dots together and warn. So you can't ask me to go from warning against this backdrop to then over here, because it's inconvenient that the particular influencers are people who look like me or who maybe American citizens or whatever the reason be. I can't do it. I have to still call it like I see it, truth to power. So the reason I said I'm having kind of a 1993 moment is because, I mean, a lot of you already know this story, but in 1993, I had been working already for a couple of years on analysis about the emergence of this version of the jihadist movement, and Osama bin Laden in particular, who was not a household name, and I wished he'd never become one. And luckily, I also have an opportunity to engage with middle school, and they don't know who he is, and that's great. I'm looking forward to that, when no one remembers him. But nobody really understood who he was or that he was going to have any influence, because we're talking about the Cold War is ending, peace is going to break out all over the world. We're really not going to worry about someone who doesn't have a card-carrying set of members of their group. Very different from the types of leftist nationalist terrorism that we had experienced in the 70s and the 80s, and state-sponsored terrorism. So I am a big fan of analogies. So I use the analogy that Osama bin Laden was like Donald Trump, who at the time was a real estate visionary. He was doing things rather differently in real estate, and he wasn't making a lot of friends, but he was getting things done. So he had the vision, he had the financial wherewithal, although I guess we still don't know where it came from, but he had the financial wherewithal, and so he was doing it, and people knew who that was. They didn't know who Osama bin Laden was. Now, nobody believed me still, but the interesting thing is, I think that comparison is truer today than it ever was. So Osama bin Laden did not pilot a plane and crash into the World Trade Center or the Pentagon or Pennsylvania. He never blew up an embassy. He never shot anybody like Lawrence Foley, or he never conducted an attack. But he influenced them all. So that power of influence, we've got to stop making it convenient or ignoring when it's inconvenient and recognize how powerful it actually is. So when I'm, in helping create the CT strategy, when I look out at the landscape, what I see is a global rejectionism of globalization. This is just the pendulum swinging, because to me, the jihadist movement was the response to the failure of Arab nationalism and the Muslim Brotherhood in a post-World War II environment where the Middle East was struggling to create its own governance against structures, meaning borders, that were completely artificial and forced upon them, upon those nations. So if jihadism was a reaction to that, globalization has created fears of existential fears of identities across the globe, whether they be gender, race, ethnicity, language, religion, all of them. People fear their identity is being crushed by this homogenizing force of globalization. And I think the next wave of terrorism is going to come from that. And just like in 1993, nobody believes me, but I can point to the same person as my analogy. So that is really what I wanted to highlight, was the role of influence and not dismissing it when it's uncomfortable. So, thank you. So hopefully we've left a lot of time for questions. We really wanted to do that, knowing that we have to get out of here right at 5. So yes, we'll go ahead and do as others have done, take 2 or 3, and then we'll.
Right. Thank you so much. I have a couple of questions. Number one, the model assumes that institutions affect the roles of leaders. I just want to ask, can leaders also then affect the shape of institutions? And more importantly, when can they shape the form of institutions? My second question is then, how do then these different roles affect internal delegations of terrorist activities between senior leadership and mid-ranking leadership? And then how then do they engage with the agency problems associated with that delegation? Thank you.
Yeah, we'll take 2 or 3. That one's definitely going to you guys, though. See how I deflect.
So a lot of time is spent talking about leaders at the very top, and I was wondering how leadership removal of third in commands like KSM affected how terrorist groups are able to function.
Thanks. Some research shows that decapitation has little to no effect if the organization is 7 to 10 years old. And beyond that, that definitely has been shown to have no effect. Have you seen that in your research, in terms of, especially in terms of the quadrants that you've defined, any overlap with that research?
We just did our internal discussion about who's going to handle all those questions. So maybe I'll exercise my prerogative and we'll sort of walk backwards. So thank you, sir, for your question about the age of the organization. So this is certainly one of the dynamic assumptions that's been tested. So if you look at the work of Jenna Jordan, if you look at the work of Brian Fishman, there's certainly the sort of the tragedy of newness, right? So 90% of all restaurants fail in the first year, 90% of all terrorist organizations fail in the first year. And one of the findings is that it is absolutely easier to collapse an organization when it is younger, right? So you have less bureaucratization, you have less institutionalization. Our work does not explicitly test that assumption. So this is one of Jenna Jordan's conclusions, right, of how age impacts the durability and the effectiveness of decapitation. And to go back to what Tricia had said with regards to her comments, what we're interested in is actually not testing that, but sort of unpacking that argument to determine what are the assumptions that are underpinning that. And the assumption underpinning that is that the leader has some actual operational impact, right? And that operational impact endures and deepens and goes greater over the length of that organization's lifespan. And so one of the projects that we did, in fact, over 14 weeks over the summer, was walk through systematically all the sort of hypotheses collected in this very robust research program of decapitation, and then actually take a step back and saying, what are the sort of meta assumptions that that scholar is making, right? So if the argument that a scholar makes is that decapitation has some impact on recruitment, then there's a sort of implicit assumption about the role of the leader's charisma, the role of the leader's personality, the role that the leaders perhaps played in the branding of the organization. If the argument is something about sort of organizational survival, then there's some impact, there's some role that the leader is playing in keeping that organization together. And so what we actually did was map all of these different hypotheses to specific assumptions, binned either with regards to institutionalization or with regards to the way that the leader manages. It's probably a much longer answer than you were hoping for. Do you want to take the middle question and then?
I just want to add on decapitation. The question, another question to ask also is why? Why are we choosing to decapitate? Like, what is it we expect to get out of it? Because I think there's a mismatch very often, and especially in the political or the policy side, expectations of what removal of a leader is going to do versus what those of us who've been doing, counterterrorism for a while know is going to end up or is likely going to happen. So on the different types of leaders, when you're talking about the plot manager, again, the mastermind of the plotting, that's an individual who, when you remove, you probably are going to reduce attacks for at least some period of time. Sometimes the person who replaces that person is worse, from our perspective. So that's a risk of going into that kind of thing. When you remove the influencer, someone at the top, the reaction to that might be more terrorism at first. It doesn't necessarily produce what you think it's going to produce, but it is also very hard to know over the long run whether or not leaving that person in place and being able to see their narrative discredited over time would have had greater negative impact against the terrorist movement or group. We don't know, because we can't do the counterfactual on the same thing. My parenting is very much part of how I counter terrorism. And my feeling was, terrorists have nothing on toddlers and teenagers. So what I felt, for a really long time was the best thing we could have done against Al-Qaeda was, or at least bin Laden, was get to a place where no one even knows who he is. Because that's what I tell my kids with a bully, right? And I recognize today with cyberbullying it's hard, and my son has been punched a few times. He's a learning disability, so he's been bullied. But if he responds in kind, he's just, giving credibility and power to the bully on the other side. So as much as it is painful, walking away and just continuing to be who he is the best solution for the long run. But we never test that in counterterrorism, so I don't know. Maybe I'm wrong.
I actually just want to follow up with a plug for a piece that Dan Byman wrote with Chris Fair years ago that actually implicitly makes this argument. It doesn't draw the toddler analogy, which is exceptional, but if anyone has seen toddlers, the way that you deal with a tantrum, for example, pulling every box of Lucky Charms off a shelf, hypothetically, in Safeway, is that you ignore it, right? And so Dan Byman and Chris make this argument that the way that you actually, a very effective CT strategy is just to ignore, right? And it reduces the threat. You make fun of the terrorists. You point out how absurd it is to stick, explosives in your underwear before taking a flight, and to point out what flunkies many of these individuals are. Your question asked about KSM, which is very much an example of an operational manager. I would actually point to the other end of the spectrum and look at the impact of decapitation of Anwar al-Awlaki, who is not a hands-on operational leader, right, but very much exists in this symbolic space, and his removal has had after effects that we continue to feel, reverberations that have been felt for years as a result of his removal. And then the very first question, it's Alif, right? All the way in the back. So questions about leaders impacting institutions? Absolutely. So what we're looking at with our research is not this sort of causal flow, right, of an X to Y to Z, but actually a dynamism that, to Gina's point, actually, in our opinion, reflects the way that these organizations actually function and the way in which all of these characteristics are impacting each other, right? The way in which counterterrorism pressure forces leaders to be different leaders, forces the group to change in form and function, for example. And I think your second question was about delegation. Did I get that right? So I wrote down, because I thought people would ask, one of the criteria that we're talking about in institutionalization is this exact question, right? So the ability of delegation functions, the central process of control, even down to local process of control. So for us, it is embedded in the very notion of institutionalization, that ability to delegate, that ability to sort of move on to a lower level, tasks that the leader, quite frankly, just cannot perform by himself.
So, should we take another set of questions? Do we have time?
Did you want to say anything? No?
Okay.
Thank you. So, Dr. Arsenault, you said that you were taking models from business and organizational management, sports management. I'm wondering what you've found, if anything, is unique about how you have to understand terrorism leadership in ways that, we can't just apply models from other organizations. Or if you find that, like the new paradigm, the quadrants that you've come up with, maybe you could apply those to other types of violent groups or just other types of, leadership organizations in general.
Hi, so it feels like for a lot of groups more on the far right side, there's like, say in cells, there might not be a centralized leader, but there's some kind of like impetus or consensus that pushes them forward in some kind of direction. Is there any application of like terrorist leader studies to figure out what that direction is?
Is that it? Right? We just get two? Okay. So, do you want to?
Sure, I can talk to the first one. So, Handa, that's a great question. In my office right now, I could literally bury myself behind the stacks of all this business literature that in my mind was actually rather duplicative. There were a lot of books that tended to say the same types of things about leaders. If I had to draw a distinction about what is different between business literature and sports management, theological literature, one of the things that is unique is that being a secret, clandestine, violent organization, we argue, actually makes the role of the leaders much more important than if you are the leader of the Green Bay Packers or if you're the leader of an evangelical church. We studied last summer, there have been many books written about essentially Billy Graham's role in being both a charismatic leader but also a hands-on leader in sort of fomenting this identity of an evangelical movement in the United States. And the thing that really sets terrorism apart is that all of these things that are true in the other domains are actually more true in terrorism. Also because you often tend to have a higher concentration of power in many of these leaders. But there's so many dynamics that we noticed that were quite similar. So one of our colleagues, Joyce DeBille, had this brainstorm. Was it during the Super Bowl or was it during a championship game? NFC championship game, where there was a graphic that was put up about all of these coaches having worked with other incredible coaches. And so we had this text back and forth and this discussion about how in terrorism there's a similar dynamic, right? That if you've studied with certain people, it gives you a cachet, it gives you credibility, simply because of who you've worked with, who you've fought with, right? So for us, that unique factor is that it takes all of these things that we know to be true and actually makes them even more true in the terrorism component. As far as, I'm sorry, I don't know your name.
Natalie.
Hi, Natalie. So I just wanted to say a quick word about far right. So we haven't applied our work necessarily to the incel movement, but one of our hopes is that by having a case study be the 1920s Klan, that we'll be able to draw comparisons to other far right and white supremacist organizations today. And part of the reason that we chose this is that some of the similar conditions that we saw in the 1920s are present now. So conditions like nativism, xenophobia. But I did want to bring up a point that Tim had mentioned earlier in the excellent panel, I thought, on incels and right-wing terrorism, was that Tim made the point that in the 1920s, there's a higher tolerance for cultural violence than we have right now in 2020. And I want to echo the point that Tricia made about the Klan. One of the things that separated the 1920s Klan from what we have right now is that they were effectively operating with impunity, right? They were operating in a culture in which they were representing dominant views on immigration. And as a result, there was a greater appetite for the sort of fraternalism and nativism, and quite frankly, vigilante use of force that then became dominant with the rise of the Klan then in the 1920s. But our view is that we could take this similar model and further expand it to look at other right-wing organizations that are active right now, perhaps even the incel movement insofar as it sort of borrows on and touches on dynamics that are present here as well.
One point I wanted to add to what Liz said is I think the other thing that we're grappling with, and one of the reasons we selected cases that span a significant amount of time, is it's possible that the prevalence of decapitation is changing the nature of these leaderships. Being a hands-on leader creates an incredible number of risks, as some of the leaders we looked at found out. And being a symbolic leader doesn't mean that you don't incur those risks, but that the need to sort of have a presence but not be in sight is becoming for groups, with a few exceptions, maybe like Lashkar-e-Taiba, very few groups are operating with a lot of impunity. And so that's probably, if you have a risk of decapitation, that's probably shaping a leader's ability to be involved in a hands-on way. And probably, we haven't tested this, so this is more off the cuff, maybe leaning towards more kinds of symbolic leaders as being the dominant model, while decapitation is such a concern. But again, that's more of a hypothesis than something we've actually been able to test. I think we're trying to step back a little bit from the decapitation and look really more at the leadership. And then the next step is to look, because I think a little bit the cart and the horse have been reversed. And that is we've looked at decapitation without really looking at leaders a lot. So we're trying to sort of reorient that a little bit.
I want to answer both of those questions
Great.
too. I just want to add on leadership and terrorism, another aspect of it that I think is different and difficult, and absolutely the fact that we're talking about a really tiny number of individuals it makes it almost impossible to generalize. But often in these types of tightly knit clandestine organizations, you're also talking about family members, people who are bound together either through family or in prison. They have been through a lot together, and the amount of trust and the nuances of those relationships are precisely what allow for leadership shifting, for someone to be the person who answers these questions or is in charge of this today, but might defer to someone else tomorrow. And even bin Laden used to do that as well, to try to show deference to someone. So those are very difficult to understand without a lot of, I think, intel to help you see a lot of that, because they do obviously try to operate in secret. On the issue of incel, So I have been on joint duty over at the National Counterterrorism Center for almost the past 2 years, where I've been working in the Strategic Operational Planning Department, and which is more of a policy arm. We've supported the National Security Council's strategy and implementation. And the last strategy, the one that was signed by the president in 2018, speaks to the domestic, we call it domestic terrorism. That's not what, well, people call it, but that's not what we call it. But speaks to some of these issues. And so we are working to understand, and a little further along than what Nick had described. I will say, though, that again, I guess I don't know why, but it is so easy for me to step back and see that this is also stemming from a global reaction to the empowerment of women. In fact, the Georgetown's Gender Justice Initiative and the Peace and Security Index notes that women in the United States are subjected to intimate partner violence at a rate 10% higher than the global average. So that's nearly 40% of women in the United States. We're talking hundreds of millions of people. In most Western democratic countries where women have become more equal in the workplace, the incident rate is also higher than the global average. So I don't see how you can just walk away and not see. I'm not saying there's a causation, but there's certainly something there that suggests one aspect of being able to justify that kind of violence is immersion in an environment that has influenced you into thinking you're us and they're them. I mean, it's just that the language matters. So when you have influential high-level leaders in the world, you know, on Twitter or elsewhere in the media, who are using language that's very demeaning to women, you know, it makes it more acceptable. So I guess we have around. We can. Sorry, that?
So that'd be a real dark thing to end on.
No, yeah. So we need. This is counterterrorism. We're not gonna. It's like there's no rainbows and unicorns here. So, but there is cupcakes down the street though. Maybe this last two, if we have time. Do we have time?
No.
No.
Yeah.
We have 4 minutes.
We have 4 minutes. All right.
Okay, I'll go quickly.
We might not answer your question.
Thank you all so much. Piggybacking off of Natalie's question earlier, in this era where we're seeing so many of these decentralized terrorist movements, where we have fewer leaders who occupy that more symbolic role, how do we tackle those problems versus, you know, the more hands-on leadership where we know if we take them out, something, you know, we might actually see a tangible effect, whereas here it might not matter as much?
I'm going to defer to you on that, Gina.
So I have the answer. Oh, maybe. We should definitely end on that one because I have a good answer.
Oh, great.
Like a positive answer.
You kind of alluded to this, talking about Christine Fair and Dan Byman's work on doing nothing or countering with humor, but what types of counter-narratives do you think are most effective against terrorist leaders? I know there's the example of DoD releasing the AQI propaganda footage and that kind of backfiring, making fun of Zarqawi and things like that. So what types of examples are out there, and what do you think about that?
Okay. Very, very quickly.
You wanted to take them.
That's fair, actually. That's completely fair, though. So just on language, you know, this is a really dicey area, in my opinion. I don't think that mocking someone who's willing to kill a lot of people is the best pathway to go down. But you know, in most cases, you're still, if you're talking about the figurehead type terrorist leader, you're talking about someone who potentially wants their position acknowledged. We don't ever talk about this, right? Because we don't negotiate with terrorists ever. But you know, unfortunately, what ends up happening is that these individuals and their movements and their groups are sitting on top of legitimate grievances that affect a lot more people who, by the way, get ignored in all of this. So some of it, you know, exploring that idea of not talking to terrorists is probably a good idea in this day and age. But to your question, how do we? So I'm going to quote the very brilliant Albus Dumbledore, because I think he gave us the solution. He said, "Words are our most inexhaustible source of power, capable of both inflicting injury and remedying it. So, words. That's the only positive thing I have to say. So thank you. Thank you, Bruce. Thank you.
So my thanks to, just reconvene just for closing remarks. My sincere thanks to the last three wonderful presenters for shoehorning that in with other schedule commitments pressing on them. Deeply appreciated and a very thoughtful and provocative panel, indeed in keeping with the rest of the conference. All I want to say at this stage, really, on behalf of Team CSTPV, are my thanks. My thanks to Director Keir Lieber for, frankly, funding this and letting it go ahead. I'm deeply, deeply grateful to that. My thanks to all the SSP faculty for excellent presentations and for all the effort and work they've put in. Also to yourselves, the students, for the very lively questioning. It's a real tribute to Georgetown to come here and be hit with a barrage of excellent questions. My predecessor, Richard English, always marks universities by that, how quickly the questions come and how incisive they are when you pass those tests with flying colours. And thank you for that. Also, a very sincere thanks to Jordan Money at the back. Our university is a very different. One sociological generalization that I think I can state with confidence is that academic conferences everywhere create an enormous bow wave of logistical disruption and pre-planning, since, like Napoleon's armies, they march on their stomach. It's one of those kind of depressing conclusions that to get any kind of high-level intellectual discussion, you have to sort of feed the gut well, first of all. But for all the catering logistics and all the pre-planning logistics and all of that, thank you, Jordan, sincerely. I can only guess how much work it must have made you. But of course, I wish to really reserve a very special, if brief, word of thanks to Bruce Hoffman. Firstly, for setting up CSTPV in the first place with Paul Wilkinson. Secondly, for 25 years later, helping us celebrate our birthday in quite such style and with quite such generosity. I think it's a sort of fairly open secret that the British-American relationship is often very close, but it does have its ups and downs. I was a little bit struck last night, walking into the British Embassy in Washington for the first time, to be greeted by a full-length portrait of George III, which struck me as either very bold or very tactless, depending on one's viewpoint. So, as I say, it has been a relationship with its ups and downs. Not that the Brits are sore losers or anything like that. But I think the vigour and the rigour of our discussions over the last couple of days is a tribute, both in very general terms, to the importance of transatlantic dialogue on these urgent questions of terrorism and how on earth we should respond and not make it worse, and also more specifically to the enduring and, dare I say, flourishing St Andrews and Georgetown relationship. Definitely our turn, Bruce, to host you, I think, next time round. And all I would finish by saying is that as we approach, or indeed have already entered, this third decade of an already tumultuous and turbulent 21st century, we do not forget in St Andrews that we are lucky to have such friends. Thank you.
I completely forgot the worst thing in the world is to follow Tim Wilson on anything, so I can hardly be as articulate. Very briefly, but very sincerely, let me thank Jordan and Samantha, who really worked enormously hard to make this conference possible, genuinely. So please join me in a round of applause for both of them. Thank you to everyone who came from Scotland and Northern Ireland, and especially the three members of the House of Lords that not only graced us with their presence, but manifestly contributed to the success of this conference. We're very much in your debt, Lord Carlisle and Lord Campbell. Lord Evans has gone away. And finally, at least when I was director, perhaps still the case, but when I was director of security studies, the first question we always asked whenever we did anything is, how does this benefit our students? I won't be presumptuous enough to think that you benefited from this event, but I can tell you how enormously heartening it is to see so many both graduate and undergraduate students here. And you guys have stayed till the very end, so this means that the conference definitely was a success. So thank you to the Georgetown students for being here. Thank you again. Bye-bye.